In this race, we have not received the final count to include military and provisional ballots. This has been a very close race, and we are awaiting certification by the Secretary of State. This particular race was watched not only by the people of this state, but by the entire nation and many around the world. Why? Because I believe the heart and soul of our country is at stake. Like most Americans, I'm concerned about the future of our country, both financially and morally.
Judge Roy Moore, the Republican nominee for the United States Senate in that special election held Tuesday night in the state of Alabama, where apparently he finished second. He lost the race, but he says right there he's waiting for certification, waiting for the votes from overseas and the military to be counted before he formally concedes, and waiting for the certification of the Alabama Secretary of State. The curious case of Judge Roy Moore. Was it about public policy, or was it about suggestions and attacks on his personal and public morality? With the verdict of the voters apparently in hand, we're taking a look at this race analytically in terms not only of the relationships between, or the relationship between a candidate and the electorate, but once again, inescapably, the relationships that develop between the sexes. Because that was so much of the campaign, the charges about Roy Moore and his dating life and liberties he allegedly had taken with younger women, though it may have happened 40 years ago. Joining us now via Skype from deep in the heart of Texas, from Houston, Texas, is the lady who deals with matters of the heart and relationships, a relationships expert and psychologist, Jill Robin Payne. Jill, you've had some time to take a look at this race in Alabama and take a look at the reactions of people both in the Yellowhammer State and nationwide. What does this boil down to in your analysis?
Well, what I've been telling you, we talked last week about the herd mentality. And so what's happening is our society is changing from a guilt culture to a shame culture because of social media. And there's a difference. And so the difference is that people are being, when they're found out they've done something wrong or had poor judgment, what is happening is their character is being stained. Whereas if you're in a guilt-ridden society, which is usually a Judaism Christian society, they usually have a guilt culture, and that's basically where you're innocent until proven guilty, and actually your character is not stained because you are able to be forgiven. You ask for atonement, you ask for forgiveness. And so what's happening now is people are afraid to admit things, and it's causing people to, why would you want to admit anything anyway if you're going to be shamed and therefore you're going to be shunned from society? So that's one thing. Then you're having the herd mentality, which we talked about last week about people getting on the dance floor, and then everybody's getting on the dance floor. And so what happens there, you only need 5% of people that may be correct, may not be correct, and they lead the other 95%. It's pretty scary. So I think it's really gutsy of him to say this is affecting our culture, our morality, because he's right.
Well, he may be right, but it may have cost him a seat in the United States Senate. We will see once the other votes that he wants to have tabulated come in, and then the Secretary of State makes a final judgment on that race. Jill, there is breaking news that I need to pass along because it involves politics, but this time it's a turnabout. We are getting news from Kansas City that a Democrat woman by the name of Andrea Ramsey is dropping out of the race for Congress there on the Kansas side of Kansas City because she had to settle a lawsuit in 2005 that she sexually harassed and retaliated against a male subordinate who said he rejected her advances. Now, this is Turnabout that is the polar opposite of what we saw with Judge Roy Moore and the allegations
Right.
of some 4 decades ago.
Okay. This sexual harassment is apolitical. It's not political. And what's happening is that people, it's really, JD, a lot with social media and the news media. I'm going to talk to you about the Milgram experiment, where obedience, we are obedient to authority. And there's also something called truthfulness bias. And that means that right when we read something, we believe it. And this is all of us. And unless we have some time to reflect and we're disrupted and we look into it, we will believe it. And so this on social media, everything is very fast. So people are, it's like we're on a wave. And so people are getting caught in this sexual harassment when actually it may not be truthful what's happening. Because remember, it's allegedly. We don't have proof. And can you remember, I'm old enough to do this. I can't remember. Some things have happened to me we won't get into, and I cannot remember the names of the people or really the faces, maybe the place of who they were.
Yeah, it is interesting, the power of memory, or perhaps should we say suggested memory. Let me move from that to another aspect of how things are playing out politically. Earlier this week, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, the Democrat of New York, who wants to run for president herself, last week, she led a movement to get Al Franken to quit his Senate seat. Now, of course, her focus turned to the President of the United States, saying he should resign. As we know, President Trump loves to use social media. He went through a litany that is familiar with those who oppose him, like in the Republican primary, Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham called me for money. Oh, he said do anything for money. Similar words, that's a paraphrase, President Trump used about Senator Gillibrand. Senator Gillibrand comes out after that and attacks President Trump for being sexist and that she refuses to be silenced. Now, is this double standard going to continue to work? Will women who go into public office be able to get their licks in, so to speak, and then when someone responds, why, you're being a sexist, you're, pardon me for lapsing into colloquialism from the playground at elementary school, you're, quote, hitting the girl, and we don't hit the girl. We've got about a minute and a half. I'd be interested in your evaluation of that.
Oh, gosh. Okay. It's going to backlash. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's in business, and he's one man surrounded by a bunch of women. And I will not talk to you about the vulgarity of what these women that he works with will say, sexual vulgarity, worse than men that I've ever heard. So basically, the women are personalizing this right now. And soon enough, just like I said, when people sit back and they ask questions and they look at what's going on and they say, does this really make sense? If so, why? And if not, why not? And people need to sit back and ask themselves these things. And that's what's going to happen. So it's going to backfire. These women, you know how it is. What goes around comes around. And that's not just a saying.
Well, we appreciate the fact that you have come around to join us again on this Friday, Jill Robin Payne. I would ask you to stay with me because I've got a couple of other questions. Those who join us today are intensely interested in the dynamic as it continues to evolve between men and women. I guess it has ever been thus, but with these new permutations, these new allegations, these new reactions, the new implementation of social media, hyper-sensationalizing, if not hyper-sexualizing what goes on. A few more questions, so Jill, stay right there. We'll step aside for news headlines and return with Jill Robin Payne right after this.
Our new strategy was prompted by the undeniable fact that the Iranian regime's behavior is growing worse. The nuclear deal has done nothing to moderate the regime's conduct in other areas. Aid from Iran's Revolutionary Guard to dangerous militias and terror groups is increasing. Its ballistic missiles and advanced weapons are turning up in war zones across the region. It's hard to find a conflict or a terrorist group in the Middle East that does not have Iran's fingerprints all over it.
That is the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, as we welcome you back. And likewise, welcome back our guest, relationships expert and psychologist, Jill Robin Payne, Skyping in from Houston. Jill, I wanted to use this example because obviously Ambassador Haley is issuing a stern message to the Iranians. And certainly we have seen women in positions of authority before. I think of Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel in the 1970s, or Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom as Prime Minister in the late 70s or early 80s through the 80s. But given the mindset in Persian or Iranian culture, indeed in the Islamic world, do nations such as Iran take a woman seriously in the public square when she's making those kind of accusations?
Well, there's a lot of things. I'm agreeing with you on that. Culture is they look at women as not equal. Now, the younger generation is a little bit different, so they're going to maybe listen more. The mid to older generation, definitely not, most likely not. And her beauty, because I think she's pretty, that can work towards for her or against her. So there's a lot of different dynamics. Now she's representing us, so just by representing the US right there, that's giving her more authority. So there's a lot of dynamics working there, so we're just going to need to see what's going to happen.
Well, certainly a very stern threat to the Iranians. It is worth noting, for what it's worth, that in this day and age of social media, the Iranian mullahs or the Iranian government tweeted back a picture of Nikki Haley side by side with Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations back in the early 2000s, the suggestion being that this was somehow false. So they offered a response, which means they felt on the world stage they should at least respond. Jill Robin Payne, it is always enlightening to have you with us, especially now as we try to make our ways through what appears to be a change. You mentioned the change in culture from a guilt society to a shaming society. It's a shame we don't have more time, Jill, but we look forward to having you back real soon to talk about how other permutations on relationships and the relationship between the sexes continues to dominate our news in the days ahead. So thanks for your time today. We look forward to having you back again real soon.
Thanks, JD.
Jill Robin Payne with her thoughts, and given the headlines and given what Jill has to say, I'm kind of curious what you have to say. Jill told us she expects a backlash from all the talk of sexual harassment. Again, I just mentioned the fact that in a congressional race in Kansas, a Democrat woman withdrew from the race because she had to settle a case of sexual harassment. Your thoughts about all of this at 1-877-NEWSMAX. Give me a call. I'll have you next.